Yes, good afternoon, everybody. It's always known as the graveyard shift, and I thought, I've got a great idea this afternoon. We'll kick off the afternoon talking about regulation and legislation. Brilliant. But there is actually a serious point to all of this. I mean, I just alluded to, I have been in the industry for 40 years, and obviously there's always been, when it comes from a manufacturing perspective, this evolution in the way that we actually design and then ultimately manufacture tyres. But with the way that actually legislation and regulation is going, we actually now perceive it as being more like a revolution rather than evolution moving forward. There is a little bit of a caveat with all of this afternoon, and that is that with some of the regulation, which I think Andy is still around, he alluded to, for instance, to do with EUDR, some of these regulations are a bit of a moving target, and we're still not completely sure of some of the time frames, or even if there may be some adjustments made to some of these regulations. So I'll give you what I know at the moment, but as I say, this may change. So as I said before, I'm just going to cover off some of the key areas of regulation and legislation in the next 20 minutes, which, to be honest with you, is extremely challenging. I have a reputation, as Tracy will know, of always running over, and there is actually a timer on here, so I can't do that today. But it is an extremely complex area, and I'll do my best to try and navigate you through some of these regulations that are coming forward at the moment. And if you believe, well, come on, Steve, a lot of this is very EU-orientated, it doesn't really matter to me. Trust me, it does. So when it comes to regulations, it says on the screen there's going to be a huge wave of new regulation coming through. And I'm just going to give you the perspective over the next 5 years. And as you can see that's coming on the screens now, these are some of the regulations that will actually have an impact within the tyre industry. Of course, in 20 minutes, I can't cover all of these. And I will just go through 3 of the ones which are more up and coming than other ones at the moment. As I mentioned before, you may be saying, well, we are not part of the EU, so surely a lot of these regulations are not applicable to us. But as you know, there's only one tyre plant left in the UK, up in Carlisle. Pretty much every tyre that comes into the UK is either imported from Europe or from a more global perspective. And almost by default, these tyres will need to be regulated because you guys know that there's a very complex supply chain, and you can't guarantee that a tyre comes into the UK that doesn't necessarily just have to be compliant, then doesn't actually find its way into a different country. So you can see on the screen there's a multitude of regulations that are coming that impacts the tyre industry. I've just done some quick animation there. And you can see, in reality, a lot of these regulations are not tyre specific. And so what I've tried to do here is actually to indicate that some of these are very much industry-led, so it's not just to do with tyres, it is to do with, for instance, the steel industry, a multitude of other industries as well. So you can see there whether that EUDR is a prime example of that. That's not just to do with the tyre industry. Obviously, EUDR impacts in other types of commodities, whether that's palm oil or other things as well. The second one down, of course, is more vehicle-orientated regulation. And ironically, there's only the one at the bottom there, Reg 117. And I think Andy alluded to this earlier on. Reg 117 is a type approval regulation, which means us as tyre manufacturers have to conform to certain performance requirements, whether that's actually to do with rolling resistance, whether that's to do with wet grip, whether that's to do with noise. And we're actually into our 4th incarnation of that, revision of that. And that means there's been more and more tighter constraints on how we as manufacturers deliver certain performance criteria, as I said before, to do with rolling resistance or wet grip or noise. So what is the goal of all these regulations? Well, clearly, and again, I think this was alluded to this morning, majority of these regulations are there to try and assist the EU in meeting their sustainability and environmental targets. The problem is that, a lot of these goals cause us real big headaches when it comes to designing and then manufacturing the tyres. You'll see in a minute or two, some of these actually work against each other, what we actually call performance target conflicts. But if we actually just go through some of these a little bit, I'm sorry, the screens are probably a little bit small, I hope you can read some of the writing. Eco-design is actually an interesting one. Eco-design regulation, when it was first muted, was actually focusing on other products apart from tyres. Tyres were supposed to have been in the second phase. That has actually changed. That's come into the first phase, eco-design has. And of course, what is the reason for eco-design? It is all about this environmental circularity, and it is all about minimizing substances of concern, obviously increasing recyclability, which is a big, big challenge within our tyre industry. And we will do this through a very complex system, something called a digital product information system, which again I'll actually mention a little bit later on. EUDR, there's been a lot of press coverage regarding EUDR, and I think I've heard over lunch, whoa, it's been delayed again. You know, it was supposed to start at the beginning of this year, so 1st of Jan 2025, it was delayed until 1st of Jan, next year. There is some rumours that actually may get delayed again, and Tracy's smiling. We don't really know at the moment. It's a real tricky area for us to really understand. All I can say, I should think that most tyre manufacturers who produce in Europe are pretty much ready for it because we've had this false start on this. And of course, EUDR is about carbon neutrality. In other words, when we manufacture tyres, we're actually doing it in a way that actually reduces the amount of CO2 in the environment. There's other regulations, two which I won't really cover very much this afternoon, which is taxonomy and this more ultimate regulation to do with zero pollution, which is all about more the incentivise rather than penalise area of regulation. Again, looking at the ways that you can entice people to buy low run resistance tyres or more quieter tyres. And then, of course, Euro 7, which definitely Andy mentioned earlier on today. Most of you will be aware of Euro 7, but boy, is that tying us in knots at the moment, Euro 7, from a manufacturing design perspective. And I'll go through that. And of course, the final one is something called Vector and WLTP. Most of you are aware that the vehicle manufacturers now are constrained to produce their vehicles to certain emission levels. And this is causing a real big headache within the industry. If I look at the commercial vehicle sector as an example with Vecto, pretty much most vehicle manufacturers now on the production side really just want an extremely low rolling resistance tyre because that helps and assists them meeting their emission targets. The problem is when it then comes to the fleet, they still have pretty much a priority that's total opposite to that, which is actually mileage. So we have a total target conflict here between what the OEMs want and what the actual fleets want. And we call this the drift effect. We've got two different customer groups. So it's a big challenge for us. And the consequences of all this? Well, of course, from our perspective as manufacturers, that it will require different processes. And as I said before, right at the beginning, a real revolution in the way we actually approach, the way we actually manufacture tyres and the materials that go into tyres. The supply chain will probably become more and more complex. And if we look at the current situation with EUDR, of course, as you know, it was alluded to this morning, this should be coming from a sustainable source. That could puts pressure on natural rubber availability as an example on that. And of course, also when it comes to performance target conflicts, I've mentioned those already, we've got to be really savvy and really clever at trying to bridge these target conflict areas. And that's why I keep going back to, I do believe genuinely, so I've been in the industry for 40 years, that we'll see a massive revolution in the way that we approach to designing and manufacturing tyres. And because there's all these new regulations that come in and we have to actually meet certain criteria, then there'll be much more complexity when it comes to the way that we test tyres and meet these requirements. And also, we have to also consider our OE customers, and our OE customers, because they are under real pressure, as I said before, to do with emissions, we have a part to play in helping them. So there's some of the consequences. This kind of crazy spider diagram is just, again, really giving you an example here that you can't have everything from a tyre. You can't have a tyre that's absolutely, ultimately best in all of these parameters that you see on the screen now. And the reality is, we've got regulation here. You've got, for instance, zero pollution or CO2 reduction requirements. So, those areas are, very much focusing on rolling resistance. But we've got Euro 7, which is about reducing the actual wear particles from a tyre, in other words, mileage. These are classic target conflicts for us. So it's really tricky, really, really tricky. Anyway, first of the three that I want to actually cover off this afternoon is EUDR. EUDR, as I said, has been around for quite some years, and as I say, should have actually come into fruition at the beginning of this year, delayed for 12 months, maybe delayed further. Obviously, the key element of this is that the idea is to ensure that we're actually getting some of these commodities from a sustainable source. We're not just chopping down, virgin forest, planting trees, because of course those forests have a key part to play when it comes to actually soaking up a lot of CO2. So EUDR has been around a long time. You see also on the screen, though, that there are other requirements to do with EUDR, things like human rights, legal right of property, and all these things. But the key thing for you guys in the room is the fact that this will all be managed through these due diligence statements. I knew you wouldn't say that very well. I'll call them DDSs. If in the future, as I think I'll show you in a moment or two, you want to export a tyre from the UK into Europe, and Northern Ireland will be part of this, then you will need this DDS reference number if it goes ahead. You'll see in very small writing, I'm sorry, the writing is very small, that why are the tyre manufacturers really fixated with this? It's because the penalties are huge. You can see there, it's up to 4% of the annual turnover of that particular company. So we're talking many, many millions of pounds if we do not comply with EUDR. So as I said, this diagram here, and I don't really have time to show you too much detail, it's just pretty much indicating that if it does go ahead in January the 1st of next year, then all the actual documentation that comes in as part of the customs documentation will have to have a DDS reference number. What the heck is a DDS reference number? What does it relate to? Well, these due diligence statements give an indication or provide information, for instance, to do with geo-coordinates. So the idea is it's used as part of the enforcement element of this, the way of managing that it's done properly, and that you can actually then track that back to certain geo-coordinates and go, yep, that's actually not been, that's not, that's not from an unsustainable source, that's okay. But as I said before, pretty much in most cases, if you export tyres into Europe, or when they're coming into you anyway, they will need to have these DDS reference numbers. We are, as I say, at the moment in this tricky situation. We don't know where EUDR is going. There are still some customer interface problems. We're going, oh, I need a DDS reference number. Where do I get that from? We have our own IT solution. It may come through something called the Eddy Wheel system as well. You may be able to get it through that. But as far as getting this information, this interface is still not completely there. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's pressure to delay it even further. But there is a political element to this. And when there are certain governments, the German government is one of those, that's still putting pressure on the EU to actually go ahead on the 1st of Jan this year. So we don't really know where we are with this. All I will say is on the third one on this, we will communicate as much as we possibly can regarding all of this when we will literally know a little bit more. Then, of course, on the tyre abrasion regulations, Euro 7, again, most of you will be aware that it's a radical difference to the previous regulation, Euro 6, which is all about tailpipe emissions. It's very focused on commercial vehicles as well. The reality is now that it includes any type of emission from any type, from any part of the actual specific vehicle. So, there's all sorts of, whether that's the actual brake particles, or in our particular case, the actual tyre particles. So these are radically different to Euro 6. I won't go through all of the other additions to Euro 7 now, But the reality is, this has really created us a real big, huge dilemma as far as where do we actually go when it comes to designing our tyres? Where is this all leading us to? As far as this actual particular test, in other words, defining the method to understand what your wear particle emissions are for your particular tyre, we know what that is. We know what the test procedure is. The test procedure is very much similar to the convoy test that is used in America to define, you don't look on the side of the tyre, sometimes you see like a tread wear of 200 or 300. That's derived through a convoy test in America. It will be similar testing procedure when it comes to actually deriving what the abrasion emission levels are on that particular tyre that you're trying to get through. What we want as a tyre manufacturer is to go down on the bottom line, which is a drum test. Drum test is actually quicker, it's more efficient. We argue could probably be more reliable, but we won't know if that actually will be adopted for maybe another 18 months to 2 years. So at the moment, as far as the testing procedure is concerned, it's this convoy test. The other big headache for us is we know how the tyre will be tested to meet these requirements. What we don't know is what the limits of these abrasion wear particles will be. Didn't really say that very well. There should be, there's been some clarity pretty much now, end of September. There was this GRBP working group that got together in September to try and work out what the limits should be. They did not come to an agreement. So the reality is there's almost like a last chance saloon with all this. Next February, this working group will get together again and try and get a consensus on what the limits will be for wear particles. If that doesn't happen, then basically the EU Commission will take over and impose what that will be. Okay. And then finally, eco-design. I've thrown this one in. I don't think this one has been mentioned today so far. As I said before, this is all about the recyclability of products and all to do with environmental circularity, and actually try and repurpose, improve the waste management of many different products, not just tyres, right from the way where we source the materials, operationally, through the use phase, through the post-use phase. You can see on the screen here, there's a multitude of products I've given as an example, but I can confirm that tyres will be the first part of this first phase of eco-design. So as I said before, it's all about reduction of certain types of harmful materials. It's part of increasing recyclability, using more sustainable materials, all this sort of stuff. And the reality is, from the tyre industry's perspective, this will actually be focusing much more on the areas of retreadability, recyclability, and life cycle assessment. So we will do this through this digital passport, this RFID, in our particular case. The reason I put this on the screen was that there is an opportunity, and this will be adopted, over quite a lengthy time frame. We expect this to sort of happen in about 18 to months' time. Around 2028 will be when we actually see the adoption of this. But the reason I end this today is the fact that because we need this digital passport, and it's complicated that we will manage the way that eco-design regulation will work, we see in the future that the RFID tag will become almost like a default in the tyre. So I know some of people have asked me in the past, is RFID going to actually increase? Because from a logistics point of view for you guys, then that actually will help and support you. What I will say is, yes, it's coming, but it's coming through this strange route because we will actually have to apply it to eco-design regulations. And that's it from me, and I've done it with 45 seconds to go. How did I do that?